Mel was getting ready to do a preliminary part of the service, and we heard a noise out in the hall. And when we pushed open the doors, we saw Cecil laying on the steps. The rabbi immediately knew that that wasn't glassware breaking, that was gunshots. And he pushed us into the storeroom.
Breaking news, reports of an active shooter at a synagogue in Pittsburgh.
11 people have lost their lives.
Shots fired, shots fired. Suspects talking about all these Jews need to die.
This is an attack on a community of faith.
Mel Wax, blessed memory, was very, very hard of hearing. He must have thought whatever had happened was over with, because he pushed the door open and the light came in, and then 3 shots, and he falls back into the room. And then the gunman follows him. The door opens again, and he stepped back over Mel's body and steps out. And I was glad he didn't turn his head, because with a shaft of light coming into the room, he might have seen us. I don't know.
The Pittsburgh synagogue shooting was largely seen as the deadliest attack on the Jewish population in America in recent history. It left 11 people dead in gruesome, anti-Semitic, conspiracy-driven violence that stoked terror in the community. But the shooter was never charged with terrorism-related crimes, and the tragedy wasn't called a terrorist attack.
You label it terrorism when it's a foreigner doing it. When it's an American doing it, it's a hate crime. In reality, it is all the same thing, and it is all causing the same damage.
So, what does terrorism even mean in today's world? The word terrorism originates from the Latin word terrere, meaning frightened. Throughout history, most scholars agreed that terrorism maintained an essential notion that it was indiscriminate violence used for political gain. But at times, terrorism became synonymous with simply forms of extreme violence, as Chicago gangsters were described in the 1920s. Today, experts like Bruce Hoffman say it's still not a universally agreed upon term.
There's as many definitions from scholars as there are scholars studying terrorism. Each different agency or department of individual governments also has their own definitions. Internationally and domestically, there's often very wide variance. I think the essential elements of terrorism are widely agreed upon in that it's violence or the threat of violence designed to achieve fundamental political change.
What impact, in your mind, did 9/11 and then the Bush administration have on how we define terrorism today?
President Bush declared a war on terror, not a war on terrorism. I don't think you can have a war on terror. Terror is an emotion. The ism in terrorism is enormously important because it denotes its political content. But when you take that political context away from it and reduce it to emotion, then anything that scares you becomes a war on terror.
How is the conversation about domestic terrorism different from the conversation about international terrorism?
Well, first, it's easier to talk about international terrorism than it is domestic terrorism. We tended to think of terrorism of something that either happens over there that doesn't happen here, or when tragically it does happen in the United States, it's something perpetrated by foreigners.
But that's not the case, not even close. Charleston, Orlando, Vegas, Charlottesville, Parkland, San Bernardino. You remember these events, and the same question comes up. Is this terrorism? Over and over, there isn't an official answer. And in fact, research shows the biggest terrorist threat to the US right now is homegrown, and predominantly far-right. The Anti-Defamation League released a report finding that right-wing extremist movements were responsible for the majority of extremist-related murders in the US last year. And between 2009 and 2018, right-wing extremists accounted for 73% of these deaths, compared to 23% for Islamists and 3% for left-wing extremists.
This is my neighborhood. I grew up here. That street down there, I played ball with my friends on it growing up. Many homes like that. I could tell you who lived there. This is my community, and my community was attacked.
This is Chuck Diamond. He's a former rabbi at the Tree of Life Synagogue and lives just blocks away from where the attack happened. In the aftermath, he became a voice for the community in Squirrel Hill.
We still talk about healing. You know, we're very affected by the recent suicides from Sandy Hook and from Parkland. It's something that'll always be with us.
Attacks in New Zealand and recently also in Sri Lanka were described as terrorism. Is that a word that you would attribute to this?
Yes, I would. It's an act of hate. So it's definitely a hate crime. He wanted to kill Jews. We're afraid to go into our schools, and we don't feel safe in our places of prayer. These are acts of terrorism, and I don't understand why some people are so reluctant to use that term. I knew each and every one of them, Joyce and Melvin, and Cecil, David, Jerry, Irving, Rose, Sylvan and Bernice, Richard, Gottfried, and Daniel Stein.
In the US, there's actually no federal charge for domestic terrorism. Let's back up. One of the most commonly used charges to prosecute terrorists associated with international terrorist organizations is material support, anything from providing advice to equipment to financial assistance. And that could technically apply to domestic terrorists, but only if they meet one of over 50 statutes, like using a weapon of mass destruction or killing or attempting to kill a government employee. The Justice Department and other government agencies have admitted that other non-terrorism-related charges are often more effective for prosecutors.
We can use gun charges, we use explosive charges, we use threat and hoax charges, we can use hate crimes.
But there are consequences of treating domestic terrorism and international terrorism differently. One of the people fighting to get a domestic terrorism statute is Mary McCord, a former senior official in the Justice Department's National Security Unit.
You've written extensively about creating a domestic terrorism charge. What would it take to do that?
One is to put domestic terrorism on the same moral plane as international terrorism. When we have violent crimes that are ideologically motivated and they're done with the intent to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, that's terrorism.
The FBI investigates hundreds of domestic terrorism cases and actively calls domestic terrorism a threat. But Mary says it doesn't get the same resources as international terrorism because there's rarely a terrorism charge that follows.
By creating a domestic terrorism offense that resides within the terrorism suite of statutes, it provides that imperative for the entire counterterrorism apparatus of the FBI, supported by others, to put the resources into that it puts into international terrorism.
So it's not just a legal issue, it's actually inspiring a preventative framework.
Absolutely. We don't want to be prosecuting the Tree of Life shooter after he shoots 11 and kills 11 people in Pittsburgh. We want to be catching him before he does that.
Barring the exceptions that Mary mentioned, generally speaking, when someone commits a mass shooting in the US, you can charge that person based on crimes like murder or weapons possession, or sometimes even a hate crime. But there's no real domestic terrorism charge, even if a link to an extremist ideology, like white supremacy, is found. There are no designated domestic terrorist organizations in the US, and that's the biggest difference between how the law sees a foreign terrorist versus a domestic one. And most lawmakers and civil liberties organizations agree. Identifying domestic groups could open the door to civil rights violations.
One reason that we're able to designate foreign terrorist organizations is because they are foreign, therefore do not have First Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution. And so we don't have the same concerns about whether we might be designating a group that engages in expression.
How can we as a society talk about these types of events?
Not to be silent. Get to know the people in your community. Education stops hatred. Terrorism is terrorism, when terrorism is based on hate.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.